I am Evelyn Vance, 34 years old, and I discovered exactly what my blood relatives thought my life was worth while standing in the shadowed hallway outside my own grandfather's mahogany-paneled library. The doors were thick, imported from Italy, designed to keep the world out, but they were not entirely soundproof. Sound, much like the truth, always finds the smallest crack to slip through if you are quiet enough to listen. I was carrying a silver tray with 2 cups of espresso, perfectly brewed just the way my older sister Brianna liked it. I had spent the last 8 months playing the obedient, quiet younger sister, the live-in accountant, the glorified maid. I was about to push the heavy door open when I heard Brianna's voice. She was laughing. It was a sharp, careless sound, the kind of laugh people only use when they are entirely certain they have won. "Relax, Chad," Brianna said, her tone dripping with bored confidence as she spoke to her husband. "Evelyn is useful until the $600 million commercial portfolio clears probate. She manages the property taxes, she cooks the meals, she keeps the estate running for free. Whatever, once the final transfer clears on Friday, we force her to sign the quitclaim deed. We move her to that roach-infested Bayside studio apartment we bought for her, and the entire estate is finally ours." "The Bayside place?" Chad chuckled, the sound of ice clinking against his Scotch glass echoing in the large room. "Isn't that the building with the collapsing roof and the mold problem?" "She's a germaphobe, Brie. She'll hate it. She's a doormat, Chad," my sister replied, dismissing my entire existence with a wave of her hand that I could practically hear. "She has never fought back in her entire life. She'll sign the papers, pack her cheap little sweaters, and go exactly where we tell her to go. She's useful until the inheritance clears. After that, she's just a liability, useful until the inheritance clears." I stood there in the dimly lit hallway, the silver tray heavy in my hands, the espresso cooling in the porcelain cups. I did not drop the tray, I did not gasp, I did not burst through the mahogany doors in a tearful rage, demanding to know how my own sister could be so extraordinarily cruel. Rage is a wild, unpredictable fire that often burns the person wielding it. What I felt was something entirely different. What I felt was absolute clarity. It washed over me like freezing water, crystallizing every emotion into a sharp, unbreakable weapon. I set the silver tray down on a marble console table in the hallway, silently turning on my heel. I walked back toward the kitchen, and for the first time since my grandfather died, I smiled. It was not a happy smile, it was the smile of a predator realizing the prey had just walked directly into a steel trap and locked the cage themselves. Before we go any further, let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Have you ever had someone underestimate you so completely, so arrogantly, that they handed you the exact blueprint to their own destruction? If you have, then you know exactly what that cold smile feels like. Drop a comment, hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe, because this is the story of how quiet women finally say the loud part out loud. And I promise you, the ending of this story is a masterclass in absolute ruin. Let me take you back to how my sister and her husband ended up sitting in my grandfather's library, drinking his scotch and plotting my eviction in the first place. My grandfather, Arthur Vance, was a ruthless, brilliant titan of commercial real estate. He built a $600 million empire of skyscrapers, luxury developments, and prime downtown acreage entirely from scratch. He was a man of numbers, logic, and cold calculation. And in a family full of loud, demanding, and ostentatious socialites, I was the only one who inherited his brain. My mother, Patrice, is a woman whose entire personality is constructed out of designer labels and country club gossip. She treats money not as a tool to build wealth, but as a weapon to assert dominance. My sister Brianna is exactly like her. Brianna was the pageant queen, the golden child, the one who married Chad, a man who calls himself an investment manager, but whose actual talent lies in wearing expensive suits and losing other people's money. And then there was me, Evelyn, the quiet one, the nerdy one, the scapegoat. I was the girl who preferred spreadsheets to shopping sprees, the one who stayed home to study while Brianna was out crashing European sports cars. My family looked at me and saw a frumpy, boring accountant. They saw a woman with no social life, no glamorous ambitions, and no spine. But my grandfather saw something else. He saw the only person in the Vance bloodline who could actually understand the massive, complex financial machine he had built. When he died suddenly of a massive stroke 8 months ago, the family descended on his $20 million estate like vultures circling a fresh kill. They immediately moved into the mansion. Brianna and Chad took the master suite, redecorating it with appalling taste. My mother, Patrice, began hosting lavish charity brunches on the manicured lawns, acting as the grieving but wealthy matriarch. And they relegated me to the smallest guest bedroom at the end of the hall, treating me as their live-in help. "Evelyn, be a dear and coordinate the caterers for the gala," my mother would say, not looking up from her phone. "Evie, balance the household accounts, will you? Make sure my new Porsche is paid off from the temporary estate fund," Chad would order, tossing receipts at me as if I were a junior clerk. I did it all. I cooked, I organized, I balanced the books, I let them order me around. I let them treat the mansion as their personal kingdom. Because there was one massive, catastrophic detail that my grandfather's brilliant, secretive lawyer had kept entirely hidden from them during the 12-month probate period. They assumed the $600 million portfolio was being split equally, or worse, that Brianna, the golden child, was getting the lion's share, with me receiving a modest allowance. They thought they were in control. They thought I was just waiting for my scraps. They didn't know that Arthur Vance had left the entire empire. Every single skyscraper, every single bank account, every single holding company exclusively to me. There was a 12-month probate window, a transition period where the estate's temporary operating accounts were managed by the family. They thought they were the kings and queens of the castle. I knew they were just temporary squatters in an empire that already had my name on the deed. But I hadn't told them. I had kept my mouth shut, watching them reveal their true colors, waiting to see exactly how greedy they would become. And after overhearing that conversation in the hallway, I knew exactly how greedy they were. They weren't just going to take the money. They were going to legally manipulate me into signing away my rights. And then they were going to throw me into a slum to rot. They thought I was a simple bookkeeper. They had absolutely no idea what I actually do for a living. I am a senior forensic auditor for a specialized federal financial crimes task force. I don't just balance checkbooks, I hunt dark money for the United States government. I track millions of dollars hidden in offshore shell companies by drug cartels, corrupt politicians, and billionaire tax evaders. I can dismantle a fraudulent corporation by tracing a single misplaced comma in a decade-old tax return. I speak the language of numbers, and numbers, unlike my family, have never once lied to me. The morning after I overheard their plan, I woke up at 5 a.m. I made them a beautiful, extravagant breakfast: eggs Benedict, fresh croissants, freshly squeezed orange juice. I served it to them in the sunlit dining room. "You're in a surprisingly good mood today, Evelyn," Brianna drawled, cutting into her eggs without looking at me. "I slept perfectly," I replied, pouring Chad his coffee with absolute precision. Chad smiled his slick, practiced smile. "By the way, Evie, the lawyers are finalizing the probate on Friday. We're going to have a nice big family dinner on Sunday to go over the final paperwork. Just some routine signatures to get the estate organized. Make sure you clear your schedule." "I wouldn't miss it for the world," I said gently. I left them to their breakfast, drove my modest sedan downtown to my highly secure federal office building, badged in, and sat down at my multi-monitor workstation. I pulled up the encrypted portal, cracked my knuckles, and decided it was time to run a full-scale forensic audit on my own family. If they wanted to play a game of finances with a federal auditor, I was going to show them exactly what the bottom line looked like. I started with the temporary estate operating accounts, the ones Chad had so graciously volunteered to manage for the family during the probate period. It took me less than 45 minutes to find the first anomaly. By lunchtime, I had uncovered a labyrinth of financial rot so deep it was almost insulting in its sloppiness. Chad was embezzling, and he wasn't even good at it. He had set up 3 dummy shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands, using the names of defunct landscaping and consulting firms. Over the past 8 months, he had been siphoning money out of the estate's liquid accounts, paying these fake vendors for services that never existed. $2 million quietly funneled out of my grandfather's legacy to fund Chad's secret gambling debts and high-risk day trading losses. But that wasn't all. I turned my attention to my mother, Patrice. She had been using the estate's commercial properties as collateral to take out massive, high-interest personal loans. She was funding her country club lifestyle, buying hundreds of thousands of dollars in designer jewelry, luxury vacations, and fine art, all leveraged against buildings she didn't even own. They were bleeding the temporary accounts dry, desperate to get my signature on Friday so they could liquidate the hard assets and cover their massive, criminal tracks. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, staring at the glowing screens filled with wire transfer logs, IP addresses, and fraudulent invoices. I didn't feel angry. I felt a cold, clinical satisfaction. A high school teacher once told me that if you give a cheating student enough rope, they will always build their own gallows. My family had just constructed a masterpiece. I didn't call the police. I didn't confront them. Confrontation gives the enemy time to hide their assets and hire defense attorneys. Instead, I opened a secure encrypted file on my desktop, titled it Project Slum, and began compiling a 400-page evidentiary dossier that would hold up in any federal court in the country. The next step was securing the fortress. They were waiting for Friday, the day the probate cleared and the $600 million became officially liquid and transferable. They planned to have me sign it all over to them on Sunday. I needed to make sure that when Sunday arrived the money was entirely, irrevocably untouchable. I left my office and drove to the towering glass building that housed Castellaniano and Associates. Ruth Castellaniano was my grandfather's personal attorney. She was 60 years old, sharp as a diamond-tipped drill bit, and possessed a terrifying lack of patience for fools. She was the only person besides me who knew the truth of the will. I sat down in her leather chair, placed my encrypted tablet on her desk, and told her everything. I told her about the mahogany door, the Bayside studio apartment, the embezzlement, the fake vendors. I spoke without a single tear, delivering the facts with the detached precision of a surgeon diagnosing a terminal illness. Ruth listened in complete silence. When I finished, she took off her reading glasses and let out a low, dangerous laugh. They think they're going to put Arthur Vance's granddaughter in a Bayside roach motel, Ruth said, her eyes gleaming with predatory delight. Vevling is suffering from a terminal case of stupidity. What do you want to do? I want the vault sealed, I said smoothly. When the probate clears on Friday, I want every single cent, every property deed, every liquid asset to flow directly into a blind, irrevocable discretionary trust. I want myself listed as the sole beneficiary with you as the trustee. I want a titanium wall built around my empire so high that Chad and Brianna couldn't even see the top of it with a telescope. Done, Ruth said, already pulling out legal pads. The money will bypass your personal accounts entirely. It will never touch an account with your name visible to them. It cannot be commingled, it cannot be claimed by your mother, Chad cannot access it, and what about the house they are currently living in? The mansion goes into the trust as well, I replied. It ceases to be my personal property, which means I cannot legally sign it over to them, even if I wanted to. Brilliant, Ruth murmured, scribbling furiously. By the time they hand you that quitclaim deed on Sunday, the paper will be entirely legally worthless. You'll be signing away a house you technically don't own anymore. I'm a federal auditor, Ruth. I smiled, a slow, chilling expression. I have already compiled the dossier. I will be submitting it to the White-Collar Crimes Division of the FBI on Monday morning. Chad is looking at 10 to 15 years in federal prison. But I want to let him enjoy his Sunday dinner first. You, Ruth said, leaning back and looking at me with deep, profound respect, are exactly like your grandfather. Let's build the trust. With the legal and financial traps firmly set, I returned to the mansion and resumed my role as the invisible, frumpy bookkeeper. Over the next few days, my family grew increasingly arrogant. They were high on the illusion of impending wealth, intoxicated by the belief that the $600 million finish line was just days away. And because they believed I was too stupid to notice, they grew sloppy. They grew cruel. The first major escalation happened on Wednesday evening. My mother, Patrice, had decided to throw an opulent, wildly expensive summer solstice charity gala on the sweeping back lawns of the estate. It was of course paid for entirely out of the temporary estate accounts. There were over 300 guests, local politicians, high society socialites, and wealthy investors. There were string quartets, champagne towers, and imported beluga caviar. I was not invited as a guest. I was expected to work. I approached a circle of men standing near the ice sculpture. Chad was standing in the center of them, holding court, a $50,000 Rolex gleaming on his wrist, a watch I knew for an absolute fact he had purchased with money embezzled from a Cayman Island shell company just 3 weeks prior. My investment strategies are entirely proprietary, Chad was boasting to a wealthy hedge fund manager. I've modernized the Vance portfolio. We're looking at a 30% yield by Q4. It just takes a firm hand at the wheel. The hedge fund manager nodded, impressed, then Chad caught sight of me standing nearby with the silver platter. He smirked, wrapping an arm around the manager's shoulder. Case in point, Chad said loudly, ensuring the entire circle of men could hear him. This is my little sister-in-law, Evelyn. She's a bookkeeper. She handles the grocery receipts for the house. Keeps the kitchen running. Isn't that cute? We let her think she's helping with the estate, bless her heart. The men chuckled, condescending, polite laughter. They looked at me with pity, a frumpy, quiet girl holding a tray of mushrooms, desperately trying to be useful to her brilliant, wealthy brother-in-law. I looked at Chad. I looked at the $50,000 stolen watch on his wrist. I looked at the investors he was currently lying to. I didn't blush, I didn't run away crying, I stepped forward perfectly poised and held out the tray. "Crab stuffed mushroom, gentlemen," I offered, smooth and entirely devoid of emotion. "They are quite rich, just be careful not to choke on them." Chad frowned slightly, missing the double meaning entirely, but he took one. I walked away, retreating back into the shadows of the ballroom. I pulled out my secure federal device and quietly snapped a high-resolution photograph of Chad showing off the stolen Rolex to the investors. I tagged it, encrypted it, and uploaded it to the Project Slum dossier. Evidence Exhibit 42: display of illicit assets to potential fraud victims. A predator never announces its presence until its teeth are already in the prey's neck. I was perfectly content to let Chad play the king for a few more days. The higher the pedestal he built for himself, the more devastating the impact would be when I finally shattered the marble beneath his feet. The slow burn of their arrogance continued throughout the week, accumulating like a toxic pressure cooker. But the final straw, the moment that permanently extinguished any lingering microscopic shred of familial empathy I might have had left, happened on Thursday afternoon. It was the day before the probate officially cleared. I was in the massive marble-countered kitchen, quietly organizing the pantry, when I noticed Chad had left his sleek, silver laptop sitting wide open on the kitchen island. The screen was glowing. He was out by the pool, pacing back and forth, arguing loudly on his cell phone with what sounded like an aggressive sportsbookie. I am not naturally a snoop. In my line of work, I require warrants to search personal computers. But the laptop was open, the screen was completely visible, and the documents displayed on it were actively regarding my own legal autonomy. A forensic auditor's eye goes where the anomalies are. I walked over to the kitchen island and looked down at the glowing screen. There was a folder open on his desktop labeled Sunday Dinner Execution. Inside it were several PDF documents, all meticulously highlighted with yellow digital sticky notes, indicating exactly where I was expected to sign. The first document was a quitclaim deed. It transferred the entire $20 million Vance mansion, along with its grounds and contents, directly into Brianna's sole ownership. The second document was an irrevocable power of attorney. It granted Chad absolute, unquestioned legal authority over my personal finances, my medical decisions, and my signature. It essentially stripped me of my rights as an independent adult and handed them to a criminal. But it was the third document that made the air in my lungs turn to ice. It was a glossy digital leasing brochure for a complex called Bayside Studio Apartments. I knew the building. My federal task force had raided it 2 years ago for harboring a narcotics ring. It was a decaying, roach-infested slum located next to a chemical processing plant, infamous for its black mold, broken elevators, and violent crime rate. Attached to the digital brochure was a yellow sticky note, typed in Brianna's distinctively bubbly font. "Evelyn's room, Unit 4B. Sign the lease on Monday. Prepay for 6 months so she can't beg to come back." I stood perfectly still in the quiet kitchen. I looked at the digital note. I looked at the picture of the decaying, rusted balcony of Unit 4B. They had measured my worth. They had priced my existence. They were preparing to steal $600 million from me. Steal my home, strip me of my legal rights, and then throw me into a toxic, dangerous slum next to a dumpster. And they were going to do it all with a smile, while pretending they were protecting me. Any small, pathetic voice in the back of my mind that had whispered, "Maybe you're being too harsh. Maybe they are just misguided family members," died in that exact moment. It didn't just die, it was incinerated. I didn't scream, I didn't throw the laptop into the pool. I pulled out my secure phone, systematically photographed every single document, every single sticky note, and every single page of the Bayside brochure. I emailed them directly to Ruth Castellaniano with a single one-line message: "The ambush is set for Sunday dinner. Lock the vault." Then I took a microfiber cloth, carefully wiped down the marble counter around the laptop to remove any trace of my presence, and went back to organizing the pantry. It was, after all, still my pantry. By Friday evening, the trap was officially armed. The 12-month probate period expired at precisely 5 p.m. The moment the clock struck 5, the entire $600 million Vance portfolio, every liquid asset, every commercial deed, the mansion itself, flowed instantaneously, invisibly, and irrevocably into the blind trust Ruth had constructed. The money was gone, the house was gone, my family was now entirely destitute, standing in a mansion they were illegally occupying, completely unaware that the floor had completely dropped out beneath them. The setup for the execution was flawless. On Saturday morning, Brianna cornered me in the hallway, her face arranged to an expression of cloying, fake sweetness. "Evie, sweetheart," she cooed, reaching out to touch my arm. I suppressed the urge to flinch. Chad and I have planned a very special family dinner for tomorrow night. We've invited Aunt Clara, Uncle Robert, and a few of Chad's important business partners. We just have some boring routine estate paperwork to go over. Just to get everything organized now that the probate is clearing. You'll be there, won't you? We want to make sure you are totally protected. Protected, the word tasted like ash. Of course, Brianna, I said, offering her a soft, compliant smile. I'll be there, I wouldn't miss it. She smiled, relieved, thinking the doormat was perfectly in place. She had absolutely no idea she had just confirmed the time and place of her own devastating ruin. That night, after the house went dark and quiet, I walked into my small, cramped guest bedroom and pulled out a single, hard-shell suitcase from the back of the closet. I didn't pack much. I am a woman who travels light. I packed my tailored suits, my secure federal laptop, a few personal photographs, and the heavy vintage brass compass my grandfather had given me when I was 10 years old. Always know your true north, Evelyn, he had told me. Never let anyone spin you around. I had a trusted security contact quietly transport my bags out the back service entrance at 2:00 a.m., delivering them directly to the private $4 million luxury penthouse I had purchased the week before through a shell company. The penthouse had floor-to-ceiling windows, panoramic views of the city skyline, and absolutely no roaches. My room in the mansion was now empty. I was officially a ghost haunting my own house. Sunday morning arrived with crisp blue skies. The atmosphere in the mansion was electric with greedy anticipation. Brianna was barking orders at the florists, arranging massive centerpieces of white lilies for the dining room table. Chad was humming a cheerful tune in the kitchen, chilling bottles of $1,000 vintage champagne. They were preparing for a coronation. I stayed in my room, staring at the brass compass in my hand. I watched the needles swing, perfectly balanced, pointing true north. I felt a profound sense of calm settle over my bones. The math was done, the audit was complete, the trap was sprung. All that was left was to let the rats walk into the cage. At 6 p.m., I put away the frumpy cardigans and the dull skirts I had worn for 8 months. I opened the garment bag I had kept hidden in the back of my closet and pulled out a custom-tailored, immaculate charcoal gray power suit. It was sharp, elegant, and cut like armor. I tied my hair back into a sleek, severe style. I applied a slash of deep crimson lipstick. When I looked in the mirror, the quiet, subservient bookkeeper was gone. The senior federal forensic auditor stared back at me, her eyes cold, calculating, and absolutely merciless. I picked up a thick, unmarked manila folder from my desk. Inside it was the 400-page federal dossier, the trust documents, the bank logs, and one printed copy of a glossy brochure for a slum next to a dumpster. I took a deep breath, opened my bedroom door, and walked downstairs to attend my own execution. The dining room was a masterclass in aggressive, weaponized wealth. The long mahogany table, which could comfortably seat 24 people, was adorned with pristine white linen, towering crystal candelabras, and the extravagant centerpieces Brianna had spent the morning micromanaging. When I descended the sweeping grand staircase and stepped into the room, the dinner party was already in full swing. There were 20 guests seated around the table. My mother, Patrice, sat at one end, draped in diamonds and holding a flute of champagne. Chad sat at the opposite end, playing the magnanimous host. The guests were a calculated mix of extended family members, Aunt Clara, Uncle Robert, and several cousins and Chad's slick, high-powered business associates. And then there was a woman I did not recognize, sitting quietly near the end of the table. She was wearing a practical navy blazer and had a small, official-looking leather satchel resting on the floor next to her chair. She had a silver case next to her water glass. A public notary. They had brought an official notary to a family dinner. They hadn't even tried to hide the executioner. The conversation paused briefly as I walked into the room. A few of the guests glanced at me, momentarily surprised by the sharp, imposing lines of my charcoal gray power suit. It was a stark contrast to the frumpy sweaters and shapeless dresses I had worn for 8 months. Brianna frowned slightly, her eyes darting over my outfit, but she quickly masked her confusion with a wide, artificial smile. Evie, sweetheart. You made it, Brianna announced, her voice echoing loudly over the polite chatter. We saved you a seat right here next to Chad. Come, sit. I took my seat. The heavy manila folder rested securely on my lap beneath the tablecloth. Dinner was served, and it was a spectacular display of culinary indulgence. Roast duck with cherry reduction, truffle mashed potatoes, asparagus spears wrapped in prosciutto, and endless pours of vintage Bordeaux. The atmosphere was convivial, filled with laughter and the clinking of fine crystal. But beneath the surface the air was thick with a very specific poisonous tension. It was the particular warmth people show a person right before they ask her for everything. Patrice leaned across the table, placing his manicured hand over mine. "We are just so glad you are part of this family, Evelyn," she said, her voice dripping with maternal concern. "You've worked so hard taking care of the house this year. Tonight is about taking care of you." "That is very thoughtful of you, Mother," I replied smoothly, taking a slow sip of my wine. "I do appreciate the effort." I ate my dinner, I complimented the roast duck, I let them have their pleasant, self-congratulatory hour. I am not a cruel woman by nature, and a good federal auditor knows that timing is absolutely everything. You do not interrupt the suspect while they are freely offering you evidence. You let the room settle, you let them grow confident, you wait until they are entirely certain of their victory. The plates were cleared and a decadent chocolate soufflé was served for dessert. The polite chatter began to die down. Brianna caught Chad's eye across the long expanse of the table and gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Chad cleared his throat, tapping his spoon lightly against his crystal wineglass. The sharp ringing sound cut through the remaining conversation, and the room fell into absolute silence. "If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment," Chad began, standing up and buttoning his expensive suit jacket. He looked around the table, projecting an aura of benevolent authority. "As you all know, the past 8 months have been a deeply emotional transition for the Vance family. Arthur's passing was a tragedy, but through it all we have remained united." He turned his gaze to me. His smile was perfectly practiced, polished to a high sheen. "And no one has had a harder time than our dear Evelyn," Chad continued, his voice adopting a tone of gentle, patronizing sympathy. "She has carried a heavy burden living here, trying to manage the day-to-day trivialities of the estate. But Evelyn, Brianna and I want you to know that you don't have to carry that burden alone anymore. We are a family and we protect our own." Chad reached beneath his chair and brought up a thick, leather-bound portfolio. He walked over and slid it across the white linen tablecloth until it rested directly in front of me. He uncapped a heavy gold Montblanc pen and set it precisely next to the leather binder. He was as helpful and attentive as a waiter serving a final meal. "Just some routine housekeeping, Evie," Chad said to the table, performing for his business associates and the extended family. "The probate cleared on Friday, which means it's time to organize the estate. We've had the lawyers draw up some simple paperwork to transfer the heavy lifting over to me and Brianna. The house, the accounts, the property taxes, we just want to make sure everything is safe, so you never have to worry about a single financial decision ever again." "It's so smart to handle it now," Patrice chimed in warmly, looking around the room for approval. Brianna reached over and squeezed my forearm. "We love you, Evie, just sign the papers, and we'll take care of everything." Down at the far end of the table, Sandra the notary quietly opened her silver stamp case. Every single face in the dining room was turned toward me. The family members looked expectant, the business associates looked bored, Chad and Brianna looked absolutely triumphant. They had dragged the doormat to the center of the stage, surrounded her with an audience, and now they were waiting for her to lie flat and let them wipe their feet. I looked down at the leather portfolio. I did not touch it, I did not pick up the gold pen. I already knew exactly what was inside it. I had photographed the quitclaim deed, the power of attorney, and the Bayside Slum brochure 3 days ago. "You want me to sign these documents?" I asked pleasantly, my voice carrying clearly down the length of the silent table. "Tonight, during dessert, with a public notary sitting right there to make it legally binding." "It's just for your own protection, sweetie," Brianna said, her smile faltering just a fraction of an inch. I folded my hands together and rested them on the edge of the mahogany table. "Before I sign anything," I said, my tone shifting. The soft, compliant inflection vanished entirely, replaced by the cold, razor-sharp cadence of a federal investigator. "I would like to show all of you something first. It will only take a moment." I reached under the tablecloth, brought up my thick manila folder and dropped it onto the table with a heavy, authoritative thud. It landed right next to Chad's leather portfolio. A flicker of confusion crossed Chad's face. It was the very first microscopic crack in his facade. The practiced smile remained, but his eyes darted to my folder, attempting to calculate the variable he had missed. I opened my folder slowly, methodically, letting the heavy signs stretch out and fill the room. "I have a confession to make to the family," I said, looking directly at Chad. "I am not a bookkeeper. I don't just manage grocery receipts. For the past 6 years, I have been a senior forensic auditor for the White-Collar Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The silence in the room suddenly changed texture. It was no longer expectant, it was stunned. Aunt Clara dropped her dessert fork, it clattered loudly against her china plate. What that means, Chad, I continued smoothly, is that I track highly sophisticated financial fraud, offshore money laundering, and grand larceny for the United States government. I dismantle criminal empires by reading the numbers that criminals try to hide. And because of my profession, I have a very strict personal policy. I never ever put my name on a document I haven't forensically verified. Evelyn, what are you talking about? Brianna stammered, her voice shrill. It's just routine estate paperwork. I know exactly what it is, Brianna, I said, snapping my gaze to her. The sheer force of my stare made her physically recoil in her chair. I read every single page of that portfolio on Thursday afternoon. I read the quitclaim deed transferring this mansion to you. I read the irrevocable power of attorney granting Chad absolute control over my life. And I read the glossy digital brochure for the Bayside studio apartments, complete with your lovely yellow sticky note dictating that I be moved into Unit 4B, right next to the dumpster. A collective gasp echoed around the table. Uncle Robert stared at Brianna in absolute horror. The business associates shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, suddenly realizing they were not attending a coronation. Brianna's face, drained of all color, turning a sickly ashen white. You snooped on his laptop. I didn't have to, I replied coldly. He left it glowing on the kitchen island like a neon sign. Carelessness is the hallmark of a lazy criminal, so before I sign your housekeeping, let me show you mine. I pulled the first thick document out of my manila folder and slid it toward the center of the table. This is an irrevocable discretionary blind trust, I announced, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I signed it on Thursday afternoon in the offices of Castellaniano and Associates. As of 5 p.m. on Friday, the exact moment the probate officially cleared, this trust legally absorbed two things. I looked up, making eye contact with Chad. He was standing perfectly still, his breathing shallow, his eyes wide with a dawning catastrophic realization. The first thing the trust absorbed, I said, was my grandfather's entire $600 million commercial real estate portfolio. Every liquid asset, every holding company, every skyscraper. It bypassed the temporary estate accounts entirely. It is now locked behind a titanium legal wall. It cannot be commingled, it cannot become marital property. You cannot touch it, you cannot authorize it. There is absolutely nothing left in the joint accounts to clear, Chad, because the vault is sealed. No one spoke. Down at the end of the table, Sandra the notary quietly snapped her silver stamp case shut and began sliding her chair backward. The second thing the trust absorbed, I continued, relentless, is this $20 million mansion. My grandfather left it to me, free and clear. As of Friday it belongs to the trust, which means the quitclaim deed sitting inside your little leather portfolio is legally worthless. It is a blank piece of paper. I cannot sign this house over to you today, tomorrow, or ever, because I no longer legally own it. Chad slammed his hands down on the table, the crystal wine glasses rattling violently. You can't do this, Chad shouted, the suave investment manager evaporating instantly, replaced by a panicked, cornered animal. We'll contest it. We'll tie you up in litigation for a decade. You're not competent to make these massive financial decisions. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I am a senior federal auditor, Chad. The paperwork is ironclad, heavily documented, and secured by the most ruthless estate attorney in this state. Any judge in the country will look at this trust and uphold it. But litigation is the least of your problems right now. I reached into my folder and pulled out a stack of paper 3 inches thick. I dropped it onto the table with a resounding slam. This, I said, is a 400-page forensic audit of the temporary estate operating accounts you have been managing for the past 8 months. It includes the wire transfer logs to your 3 Cayman Islands shell companies. It includes the fraudulent vendor invoices you created. It traces the exact path of the $2 million you embezzled from my grandfather's estate to cover your illegal sports gambling debts. Chad took a step back, his face contorting in sheer terror. His business associates stared at him, their expressions hardening into masks of pure disgust. The hedge fund manager he had been boasting to earlier slowly put his napkin on the table and stood up. I am submitting this entire dossier to the White-Collar Crimes Division of the FBI tomorrow morning at 8. I stated, my voice devoid of mercy. You aren't going to court for a civil estate dispute, Chad. You are going to federal prison for grand larceny, wire fraud, and tax evasion. I suggest you find a very good defense attorney tonight. I turned to my mother, Patrice, who was clutching her pearl necklace, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. And mother, I added softly, the trust will be initiating foreclosure proceedings on the loans you fraudulently secured using estate collateral. I hope you kept the receipts for your Birkin bags, because you are going to need to liquidate them to pay your massive debts. Finally, I picked up the printed copy of the Bayside Studio Apartments brochure. I reached across the table and placed it directly on Brianna's empty dessert plate. You picked my room, Brianna, I said quietly, the cold fury radiating from every word. Unit 4B, the one next to the dumpster. Well, since the trust now owns this mansion and you have zero assets and a husband facing federal indictment, you are officially evicted from my property. I suggest you call the leasing office at Bayside tomorrow. You are going to need that room. The dining room erupted into absolute unmitigated chaos. The pleasant atmosphere shattered, replaced by the panicked frenzy of trapped animals. Chad screamed a guttural sound of pure rage and terror. He picked up his useless leather portfolio and hurled it across the room. It smashed into a towering crystal vase, sending a shower of glass and water onto the Persian rug. His business associates were already moving toward the door, practically running to distance themselves from a man who had just been publicly unmasked as a federal target. My mother, Patrice, sank into her chair, her manicured hands clutching her pearl necklace. She was hyperventilating, her eyes darting frantically. My bags, she gasped. My loans, they'll take everything, they will, I confirmed softly. Every last one of them. Brianna broke down into hysterical, ugly tears. The poised, arrogant golden child was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, terrified woman. She lunged forward, reaching out across the white linen tablecloth to grab my arm. Evelyn, please, she sobbed, her emerald silk gown ruined by a spilled glass of Bordeaux. You can't do this, we're your family. We took you in, you let me live in a house I already owned, I corrected her, stepping back so her grasping hands caught empty air. You let me cook your meals and balance your checkbooks while you plotted to steal my entire future and throw me into a toxic slum. We were just trying to help. She pleaded, the lies still tumbling from her mouth out of habit. You were useful until the inheritance cleared, I said, repeating the exact words I had overheard. I offered her one final, freezing smile, and the inheritance just cleared. I turned my back on the ruins of their greed and walked out. The heavy oak front doors of the mansion closed behind me with a satisfying thud. The cool night air hit my face, and for the first time in 8 months I felt entirely free. I stepped into my waiting black car and drove through the illuminated streets, heading toward my new life. When I arrived at the luxury penthouse, the contrast was staggering. There was no noise, there were only floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the skyline the blind trust now effectively owned. I poured myself a single glass of vintage red wine and set my grandfather's heavy brass compass on the counter. The needle swung gently, settling perfectly on true north. I knew that tomorrow morning at precisely 6 a.m. federal agents would kick in the mahogany doors of the mansion. I knew Chad would be dragged out in handcuffs. I knew Brianna would have to frantically pack before the foreclosure agents arrived to change the locks. And I knew that when she had nowhere else to go, she would have to call the leasing office at the Bayside Studio Apartments and beg them for the keys to Unit 4B. They failed to realize that the quietest person in the room is usually the one keeping score. If someone mistreats you, build an empire in silence. Document everything, and when they finally push you to the edge, let their own arrogance destroy them. Thank you for watching to the very end. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and share this story with anyone who needs a reminder that the quiet ones always win. I didn't sleep that night, I didn't need to. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, watching the city slowly transition from the deep velvety black of midnight to the bruised purple of pre-dawn. At 5:45 am I walked into my pristine kitchen, ground a fresh batch of imported Colombian coffee beans, and started the French press. I poured myself a cup, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic mug, and looked at the clock on the wall. 5:59 a.m. I took a sip of coffee. 6 a.m. across the city. At the exact moment the digital clock rolled over, a convoy of 6 unmarked black tactical SUVs pulled into the circular manicured driveway of the Vance mansion. I wasn't there to see it in person, of course, but as a senior federal auditor who had orchestrated the raid, I knew the choreography of a white-collar crimes takedown intimately. 15 heavily armed federal agents wearing tactical vests stepped out of the vehicles. They didn't knock politely, they didn't ring the brass doorbell Brianna had spent hours polishing. They used a steel battering ram to smash the Italian mahogany double doors right off their hinges. The sound of heavy combat boots pounding across the imported Persian rugs would have echoed through the entire house. I could picture it perfectly. Chad and Brianna jolted awake in the master's suite. The confusion, the sheer unadulterated terror. Federal agents. "Show me your hands." I imagined Chad wearing his expensive silk pajamas, being yanked out of the king-sized bed and thrown face-first onto the floor. I imagined the cold steel of the handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists. The agents would have immediately seized his phone, his laptop, and the $50,000 stolen Rolex sitting on the nightstand. Brianna would have been screaming, her shrill voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You can't do this. Do you know who we are?" "We own this house, ma'am. Step back," a stoic federal agent would have replied, entirely unimpressed by her silk nightgown and her absolute hysteria. They tore the house apart. They seized the financial records, the bank statements, the jewelry Chad had bought with the embezzled Cayman Island funds. They hauled Chad out the front door in handcuffs, marching him past the shattered mahogany doors and shoving him into the back of a black SUV. The neighbors, the wealthy, judgmental neighbors Patrice spent all her time trying to impress, would have all been standing on their lawns, recording the entire humiliating spectacle on their phones. By 8 a.m. the raid was over. Chad was sitting in a federal holding cell staring at a concrete wall, realizing that his life as a suave investment manager was permanently, irrevocably finished. But the devastation of the Vance family was only just beginning. At precisely 9 a.m., while Brianna was still sitting on the floor of the ruined master bedroom, hyperventilating and trying to process the fact that her husband had just been arrested by the FBI, the doorbell rang again. This time, it wasn't the federal government. It was a team of private security contractors and legal representatives hired by Castellaniano and Associates, acting on behalf of the Irrevocable Discretionary Blind Trust. They handed Brianna a formal court-ordered notice of immediate eviction. Because the mansion now legally belonged to the trust, and because Chad and Brianna had never signed a formal lease agreement, they were classified as unauthorized squatters. The legal representatives informed Brianna and my mother, Patrice, that they had exactly 2 hours to gather whatever personal belongings they could fit into a few bags and vacate the premises immediately. I received the updates directly from Ruth. I sat in my penthouse, drinking my coffee, reading the text messages as they rolled in. 9:05 a.m. Eviction notice served. Suspects are 9:30 a.m. Mother is attempting to barricade herself in the walk-in closet. 15 Suspects are packing trash bags. Security is monitoring to ensure no trust property is stolen. 11 a.m. Suspects have been escorted off the property. Locks are being changed. The mansion is secured. Brianna tried to call me. Of course she did. My secure federal phone flagged 47 incoming calls from her number in the span of an hour. When she realized I had blocked her, she started leaving frantic, unhinged voicemails on my federal office line. I listened to them while I ate my breakfast. "Evelyn, please. You have to fix this." Brianna sobbed into the voicemail, the background noise filled with the sound of her dragging garbage bags across the driveway. "They took Chad. They kicked us out of the house. Mom is having a panic attack on the front lawn. I don't have any credit cards that work. Everything is frozen. Please, Evelyn, I'm so sorry, just answer the phone." I deleted the voicemail. I didn't feel a single drop of pity. An apology delivered, only the trap has snapped shut, is not an apology. It is simply a manipulation tactic performed by a hostage. With her husband in jail, her bank accounts frozen by the federal government, and the mansion securely locked behind a titanium trust, Brianna had only one option left. She had to find a place to sleep. I can only imagine the sheer humiliating horror she felt when she realized she had to pull the crumpled, glossy brochure for the Bayside studio apartments out of her designer purse. The slum she had chosen for me, she would have called the leasing office from the sidewalk, sitting on a trash bag full of her custom-tailored gowns. "Hello," the sleazy, overworked property manager at Bayside would have answered. "Yeah, this is Bayside Apartments. I need a room," Brianna would have stammered, her voice trembling. "Unit 4B, the one next to the dumpster, is it still available?" "Yeah, 4B is open," the manager would have replied, chewing loudly on a piece of gum. "But we require first month, last month, and a security deposit in cash. And seeing as how you sound a little desperate, lady, I ain't budging on the deposit." "You got cash?" Brianna had no cash. Chad had spent all the liquid cash on his gambling debts, and the feds had frozen whatever was left. The golden child, the pageant queen, the woman who had laughed at the idea of forcing her younger sister into a roach motel, was now begging a slum landlord for a lease she couldn't even afford. My mother, Patrice, did not fare any better. When the security contractors physically escorted her off the manicured lawns of the mansion, she immediately reached for her phone. Patrice's entire life was built on the fragile foundation of high society connections. She believed that her country club friends, the wealthy women she played tennis with, the socialites she gossiped with over mimosas would rally around her in her time of need. She called her best friend a wealthy shipping heiress named Margaret. "Margaret, darling, it's an absolute disaster," Patrice wailed into the phone, standing on the sidewalk in her silk dressing gown. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding with Arthur's estate. The bank has frozen my accounts. Could I possibly come stay in your guest house for a few days? Just until the lawyers sort this out." There was a long, excruciating pause on the other end of the line. "Patrice," Margaret said, her voice dripping with absolute freezing judgment. "I was at your summer solstice gala. I saw Chad showing off that stolen Rolex, and I just saw the video of him being dragged out of your house by the FBI on the local news. Do not ever call this number again." The line went dead. Patrice called 6 more women. Every single one of them had already seen the news. Every single one of them had heard the rumors about the grand larceny, the frozen assets, and the massive federal indictment. In the world of high society, nothing is more toxic than a scandalous bankruptcy. Patrice was a social pariah before lunchtime. A month passed, the dust settled over the ruins of the Vance family. Chad was denied bail. The federal judge, after reviewing my 400-page forensic dossier, deemed him an extreme flight risk. He was transferred to a maximum security federal holding facility where he currently awaits a trial that he has absolutely no hope of winning. The public defender assigned to his case told him point-blank that he should expect a minimum sentence of 12 years. Brianna eventually managed to scrape together enough money from selling her designer clothes on internet consignment apps to afford a small, decaying apartment. It wasn't the Bayside studio even that was too expensive, but a basement unit in a complex that regularly flooded when it rained. She works as a receptionist at a low-end car dealership now, answering for minimum wage. And Patrice? She lives with Brianna in that damp, flooding basement, spending her days staring at the cracked ceiling, mourning the loss of a kingdom she never actually owned. They spent a year waiting for the inheritance to clear. They measured my worth, they calculated my eviction, and they built an entire future on the absolute certainty that I was too weak to stop them. But they forgot the most fundamental rule of mathematics: a negative multiplied by a negative always equals a positive. Their cruelty, multiplied by my silence, equaled their absolute destruction. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, watching the sunset paint the city skyline in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. The $600 million empire was completely secure. The properties were thriving under new legitimate management. The legacy my grandfather had built was safe, locked behind a titanium legal wall that no greedy relative would ever breach. I picked up the heavy brass compass from the marble counter. I traced the glass with my thumb. "Always know your true north, Evelyn." I finally understood what he meant. True north isn't a place, it isn't a mansion, and it isn't an inheritance. True north is the quiet, unbreakable core inside you. It is the absolute certainty of your own worth, even when everyone around you is treating you like a scapegoat. To anyone watching this who is currently living in the shadow of a toxic family, an abusive spouse, or an arrogant boss who treats you like you are invisible, listen to me very carefully. Do not scream at them, do not beg them to respect you, do not cry when they underestimate you. Let them underestimate you, let them believe you are weak, let them build their arrogant little kingdoms on the assumption that you will never fight back. And while they are celebrating their false victories, you build your empire in silence. You gather the evidence, you secure your foundation, you set the trap with absolute clinical precision. And when the time is right, when they finally push you to the edge and expect you to fall, you look them dead in the eye and you drop the floor right out from beneath them. Thank you for watching to the very end. If you know the absolute power of walking away and the sweet taste of delayed justice, drop a comment below. Share your story, subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that the quiet ones always win. This has been Evelyn Vance, and my audit is officially closed. There is one final detail I haven't mentioned yet. It is perhaps the most important detail of all, because it is the only thing that separates a cold-blooded monster from a woman seeking precise, necessary justice. Throughout this entire ordeal, there was exactly one innocent person trapped inside that toxic bloodline. Brianna and Chad's 8-year-old daughter, Ivy. Ivy was a quiet, observant child. She had her father's dark hair but none of his arrogance, and her mother's bright eyes but none of her cruelty. While Brianna and Chad were busy redecorating the master suite and plotting to steal my inheritance, Ivy was usually sitting at the marble kitchen island with me. While I chopped vegetables or balanced the estate accounts, she would sit there swinging her legs, coloring in her notebooks, asking me quiet, intelligent questions about how the world worked. She was the only person in that massive $20 million mansion who ever looked me in the eye and said, "Thank you, Aunt Evelyn." She was the only person who didn't look at me and see a maid or a doormat. She saw a human being. I am a forensic auditor. I destroy criminals for a living, but I do not punish children for the sins of their parents. On the Thursday afternoon before the catastrophic Sunday dinner, when I sat in Ruth Castellaniano's office building the titanium legal wall around the $600 million empire, I had Ruth draft one additional document. It was a completely separate, heavily fortified educational and living trust, funded with $5 million in liquid cash drawn directly from my grandfather's portfolio. I named Ivy as the sole unquestionable beneficiary. I named Ruth as the primary trustee. The stipulations were ironclad. The money was to be used exclusively for Ivy's private education, her medical needs, and eventually her university tuition. When she turned 25, the remaining principal would transfer directly into her personal control. But the most crucial clause in the trust was a strict firewall against her parents. Chad and Brianna were legally barred from accessing a single cent of it. They could not borrow against it, they could not manage it, and they could not petition the court to release it for family emergencies. It was Ivy's money and hers alone. I didn't tell Chad and Brianna about the trust during the Sunday dinner. They didn't deserve the comfort of knowing their daughter was financially secure while they were busy trying to throw me into a roach-infested slum. But 3 days after the FBI raided the mansion, after Chad was denied bail and Brianna was forced to move into that damp, flooding basement apartment, a courier delivered a heavy envelope to Brianna's new, dismal address. Inside the envelope was a legal notice from Ruth outlining the existence of Ivy's trust and the strict conditions attached to it. There was also a handwritten letter inside, sealed in a smaller envelope, addressed directly to Ivy. I had written it on my heavy embossed personal stationery the night before I walked out of the mansion. My dearest Ivy, by the time you read this, a lot of very confusing and scary things will have happened. Grown-ups often make terrible, selfish decisions, and, unfortunately, sometimes the fallout from those decisions affects the people who least deserve it. I want you to know that none of this is your fault. Your grandfather was a brilliant man who built an empire, and he wanted his family to be protected. I have made sure that you are protected. The lawyers taking care of you will make sure you go to the best schools, read the best books, and have every opportunity in the world to become whoever you want to be. I left you something else too. Remember the heavy brass compass I used to keep on my desk? The one you always liked to play with? I left it with Miss Castellaniano. She will give it to you when you are old enough. Always remember what I told you in the kitchen. The needle always points true north, no matter how much the world spins around you. Never let anyone convince you that you are invisible. Never let anyone treat you like you don't matter, and if they do, don't scream at them. Just smile, find your true north, and walk away. I love you very much, Aunt Evelyn. Ruth told me later that Brianna wept when she read the legal notice. I don't know if she wept out of relief that her daughter was safe, or out of crushing, humiliating shame that the sisters she had plotted to destroy was the only one who actually saved her child. In the end, it doesn't matter. The math is settled, the ledger is perfectly balanced. I sit in my luxury penthouse looking out over the city skyline, sipping my vintage red wine. I am 34 years old, free, and I command an empire. Thank you truly for watching this story to the very end. If you have ever been the scapegoat of a toxic family, if you have ever been underestimated, I want you to remember Evelyn Vance. Build your strength in silence, document the truth, and when the time comes to balance your own ledger, do not hesitate. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share this video with anyone who needs to hear this message. Because the loudest people in the room always end up bankrupt, and the quiet ones always win. This is Revenge Girl signing off.